So our journey through Art of the World begins in Africa, which is the logical place to begin, as basically all of us come from Africa. So if you've ever heard of the anthropological theory of what we call the out of Africa theory, it posits that all humans, right, come from Africa, from African origins. I won't go into the anthropology, you can look that up on your own, but again, this is why starting with Africa makes a lot of sense to me. I always try to show you a map of the area we're going to be discussing. So here you have the continent of Africa. And one of the reasons I like to show you a map is it gives you some geographical awareness, some locational awareness of where you are and what we're talking about. I find that sometimes people need a few maps, more than you know, to have some geographical awareness of the regions that we're discussing. I also want you to think about how large a place Africa really is. And again, Africa is a continent. It's not a country, it's a continent. And within that continent, you see many different countries. These countries span many different types of ecological areas. So you have grasslands, you have mountainous regions, you have rainforest, pretty much any kind of ecological zone, right? You have that when studying Africa. Yes, thank you. My cat wants to join in. So I wanted you to think about the diversity of people who live here, the diversity of geographies that they inhabit and ecologies that they inhabit. And again, you kind of can't treat them like a monolith. So whenever I talk about Africa, I talk about, it's not a monolithic place. It's made up of many different cultures, many different backgrounds, and you have to give some thought to that diversity in order to understand it. You have about 2,000 languages that are spoken here. That just boggles my mind, quite frankly. And again, you're going to have a lot of different peoples here. Now, the way that I try to approach the class, so you'll think about the structure of the class as we go along, is I try to talk about concepts in relationship to the cultures that we're discussing. So rather than kind of go through each region, right, talking about different objects, I try to think about the concepts that govern that culture, and then I present the objects through that lens. It's a little bit different than approaches that many others might try to take. They might try to have much more of a, again, logical kind of geographical approach. I'm aware that Africa is very big. We cannot, in the time we have in this class, go through each area, right? So we have to think about, to me, concepts. That figures much more into the mix, right, rather than looking at specific places. So again, I'm much more conceptual with how I approach the class. I also divide each culture into sort of a different type of discussion. I talk first about historical objects, then I move into a colonial discussion if there needs to be one. In the case of Africa, we will need to talk about colonialism. And then I end up with contemporary artists, because I think that for my students taking these classes, to know your contemporary artists is probably the most important thing for you, because if you're interested in art history, you're interested in people making art right now. So again, I go through and I think about the historic objects, then colonialism if we need to have that discussion, and then contemporary artists. So that's always going to be the structure. Here in Africa with this first video, I'm also going to use this video as a little bit of an intro to the course. So you'll notice as we talk about these ideas, these key points for looking at African art, it's also going to be a framework for you to think about how to approach the class. Because I think Art of the World, or as it formerly was known for a long time, non-Western art, this is the first semester I'm teaching it as Art of the World, it used to have the title non-Western art. This is a very different class than a lot of other art history classes you might take. So I try to use this first lecture as not only an introduction to African art, but an introduction to non-Western art in general. And I think there's some points you can think about here that are very different than how you would look at Western art. And again, I'm going to go through each of these points on their own unique slide. So we're going to go through these and kind of think about these one by one. First off, when you're looking at African art, or you're looking at non-Western art, you're looking at an art that's based on what we call oral history, or a spoken history. These are not people who write things down. They do not create written documentation. Very different from Western people who love to write things down. I mean, just go look at freaking Wikipedia, right? It's all about, for us, documentation. African culture says, why remember something in the long term? It may not be of any importance in the long term. It may only be important to the generations that are dealing with that information. So I often say that they're a generational knowledge people, where something might be important to your grandfather and your father, but then once it gets to your time, that information may not really hold any value anymore. So I always say that time to them is not about a linear kind of expression or a documentation of everything that's ever happened to you. And so there's this great proverb that you see here called this idea of an old man dying, right? When an old man dies, a library burns, because you lose all that information. But for an African tribe, they might say, well, is that very important? Was that information necessary to keep? Or had it lost its value? So they have a different attitude towards time and history. We'll see this repeated as we look at, for instance, like Indian culture, Native American culture. So again, as I'm introducing you to Africa, I'm wanting you to think about these concepts that you can carry with you, right, over the course of the class, and how these cultures differ very much from Western culture, which is the culture that you're steeped in right now. I also wanted to introduce the concept of life as art and art as life. And here's a picture of the Gelede Festival. We'll talk in more depth about this festival a little later on in our conversation about historical African objects and traditions. But I wanted you to think about this idea of, for African people, that art is part of their life. It's not separated from their life. Now, what does this mean? I always show this slide as a contrast. This is my lovely husband. We had gone to New York and gone to the MoMA Museum, the Museum of Modern Art. And he's looking right now at some Clyfford Still paintings. And I always kind of try to contrast this idea of people who are wearing masks, people who are dressed in ceremonial textiles, that these objects are part of the life and the culture. And then our experience in a Western art museum, which is we usually stand far away from an object, we look at it, and we appreciate it. African people would be like, why is this such a sterile experience, right? You just staring at this thing. There's no interaction, there's no, purpose, there's no usage. So again, I think we have to think about this idea of many of the objects that Africans make that we call art, they think of as functional utilitarian objects, which leads me to this slide, where you're looking at a piece of rock art, one of the oldest pieces of art ever made. Art historians, we debate whether you should even call this art, because is it art or is it utility, right? Is it calling to the animals for a good hunt? It's not really about artistry. But again, in art history classes, we still talk about it. And by the way, African rock art predates European rock art, so it's older than perhaps if you've taken Art History 1, the prehistoric pieces that you might have seen there. Now, I'd mentioned the word utility. So for Africans, when they think about art, they think about this idea of it should have purpose, it should have meaning, it should have a function. This is what we mean by utilitarian. It has a utility, it has a purpose, a reason that it exists. So again, you can think about how to them, art shouldn't just hang in a museum to be stared at. When you look at art objects from Africa in museums, typically we say their utility has been purged, that it has been erased. And we'll talk about that a little bit more like when we look at the hunter figures. I'll kind of circle back to this idea of utility and how when you see something in a museum, the utility has been removed. They also would believe very strongly that art is ephemeral. Ephemeral means it's not meant to last. When something has ephemerality, it's not meant to be permanent. If you think about rock art, this has been preserved because of the way that the rock overhang protected it. But typically, you paint with, charcoal on a surface. Over time, wind, rain, erosion, that's going to erase something. In the West, we'd say, oh no, we're losing that piece of artwork. In a non-Western context, we would say these people thought that art is ephemeral. Typically, they view art as having a function it's supposed to do, and once that function has been done, they don't really care if the art exists any longer. They don't really care anymore if the art is still around. So where I find in the Western context of art, we want permanence. They are like, why would permanence be important? It's not really essential. And they also feel that the artists themselves is unimportant. So I'll go to this slide, right? They feel very strongly, right, that the idea of a named artist is of no concern. African artists are usually unnamed, especially with historic objects. We don't know who made them. So on the right, you see Yoruban twin figures that we'll talk about in greater depth. When we look at historic objects, we don't know who the artists were. They're not named. But if you think about Westerners and how we deal with art, we have sort of a tradition, right, of thinking that an artist means quality, right, or an artist means something. So Michelangelo's David, very, very famous. And so I would say non-Western art really looks at anonymity as who cares who made it? It doesn't matter. Where Westerners are like, of course that has a cachet or a reason, right, to celebrate it. So again, a very different attitude. When I was first looking at African tribes when developing this class now, 17 years ago, I was struck by the fact that most African people actually are very, very specific about their names. They don't think that giving their names out is a very smart thing to do because your name has power. Your name has a certain, essence to it that if you give it to the wrong people, they can weaponize it against you. So where in Western culture with things like YouTube, Facebook, right, Westerners just put their identity out there, they offer up everything that they do. An African traditional culture would be like, well, that's just ridiculous. You're giving your enemies a platform to attack you by giving them so much information about you, especially your name. So again, there's a very different feeling between the idea of Western and non-Western in the sense of how to approach these objects and think about these objects. So again, this is going to help us when we talk about African art, but again, it will also help us as we go along through the class and talk about other pieces as well. The next video, we're going to get into the framework of the class. As I mentioned, we're going to talk about historic objects, colonialism, and then contemporary art.